Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hey everyone, and welcome to All Together, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by Ellen Massell of the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element, with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Dina Sargent. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome back to the Family Science Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the importance of a healthy lifestyle to prevent infertility and why lifestyle choices count. And joining us today is Dr. Amy Winship, who is a Rebecca Cooper Foundation Research Fellow at Monash Biomedicine Discovery Institute, focusing on reproductive biology. Hi, Amy. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. Please tell us about the work you do and what it entails.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm a reproductive biologist. So we study a lot about environmental and lifestyle factors, as well as other non-modifiable factors like genetic impacts that can impact on our reproductive health and fertility. And when we're talking about reproductive health, that's also outside of the setting of fertility. So other considerations for overall health as well.
Yeah. And what made you want to get into this field of research?
Yeah, I always was really interested in health, and I thought I'd end up in more clinical health at the, interface with people, like in a hospital as a doctor or a nurse. But as I sort of progressed through my undergraduate biomedical degree, I became really, really interested in research and just feeling like I guess you could make a difference to the trajectory of health through research.
Lovely. And we have a section called Have You Met Amy? So here we're just going to get to know you a bit more before we get started. So what is your favorite book?
Yeah, so one book I really enjoyed, this is going back a couple of years ago, but it's called The Resilience Project by Hugh van Cuylenburg, who's an Australian author and comedian, I believe. I've listened to it a few times as an audiobook, and I just found it really helpful at a time I was sort of delving into some self-help literature quite a few years ago through COVID, like I'm sure a lot of us will have been doing the same. And I found it to be really authentic, funny, emotional and educational all at the same time. I think self-work is really important, particularly in our personal relationships as well as our professional working relationships. So we can all reflect and do a bit of self-work, I think. And yeah, that's one that I found really helpful.
Yeah, definitely. I love self-help books. I've actually been not reading, but listening to Mel Robbins' audiobooks and podcasts, if you've heard of her.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
She is fabulous. She's got some really great lighthearted stuff. I do want to get into like the more nitty-gritty science of things, but I'm really enjoying her work at the moment.
Good.
So yeah. Speaking of podcasts, do you listen to any yourself?
Yeah, so of the same author, I listen to The Imperfects. So Hugh has that podcast with another Australian comedian, and they interview a wide range of Australian and international personalities. And what I really like is they share their imperfections and struggles and how they overcome and deal with those issues. But some other ones, as I'm currently pregnant, I'm listening to a few different podcasts on fertility and pregnancy. One in particular called The Kick Bump, another one called The Kick, and that's actually hosted by an obstetrician and a mum as well. And I think what's good about those is that they span topics right from preconception health and fertility, like what we'll be discussing today, through to infertility, the pregnancy journey, and birthing complications. And they're really informative, not only personally, but also for insights into the research we do even.
Yeah.
So, yeah, there are a few that I enjoy.
That's great. And I find that it's so amazing that there are podcasts for different phases of life or different experiences you go through. And there's always someone out there that's making content about whatever you're going through, whether that's pregnancy, certain things in your life where you need a bit of motivation or self-help. So that's fabulous. Thank you for sharing those with us. I've got one last question here for you, which is, do you have a role model?
Yeah, I think my parents have been great role models throughout my life. We were quite lucky growing up to go on family holidays around regional Victoria and then travel to Queensland, which is a bit warmer in the Melbourne winter. They're a nurse and builder, but always sort of demonstrated how the importance of hard work. And I guess I'm just very grateful for the hard work they put in to enable the level of education that my brother and I had so that we can sort of do what we do now. And in terms of my work, I think both of my long-term supervisors would also be amazing role models that I've had exposure to, and both really strong women in medical health and women's health research. So my Ph.D. supervisor, Eva Dimitriadis at the Royal Women's Hospital, and my postdoctoral supervisor, Professor Carla Hutt at the Ovarian Biology Lab at Monash University. I think they both taught me different working styles and different ways of thinking about clinical problems and problems that affect women through their reproductive lifespan, and then thinking about how we can address some of those problems with our research.
Yeah, beautiful. And I'm so glad you have so many role models that you look up to in your life, which is amazing. Great. Well, I'd love to dive into our topic for today. But before we talk about lifestyle as a concept, I wanted to ask you about what infertility is and if it's common.
Yeah, so that's definitely a great question. And there's very recent at-hand statistics about infertility within Australia as well as globally. So infertility is classified technically as the inability to conceive within a period of 12 months of trying. So in Australia, recent data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics shows that the birth rate's actually dropped to its lowest level on record. This rate is an average estimate of how many children a couple actually has in their lifetime. And in 2023, there were just under 300,000 births registered in Australia. So that's about 1.5 babies per couple. So that is the lowest rate since records began in the 1930s. I think we know that social factors are contributing to that decline, particularly in developed countries where, in particular, I think women are prioritising their education and then their careers. So they really don't want to necessarily interrupt their career progression with childbearing. And I think that makes sense, and that's something I've certainly experienced myself as well. But in turn, we do know, unfortunately, there are very strong links with maternal age and infertility. So this is one of the factors that's contributing. Beyond Australia, I guess infertility is on the rise more globally. It actually affects 1 in 6 couples globally, according to the World Health Organization. So it's a broader issue.
Yeah. Would you be able to expand more upon how aging affects, reproduction and fertility?
Yeah, I guess when it comes to age, it's really important to understand that the quality and the number of our eggs and sperm can be determined by our age. It's also really important to improve understanding that things like assisted reproductive technologies like in vitro fertilization or IVF aren't necessarily a treatment or a magic bullet for infertility, particularly in the context of aging. Those techniques still rely really heavily on high quality eggs and sperm, as well as the right maternal environment, including preparation of the uterus or womb for pregnancy, and overall systemic health can really play a big part in that process too. So another thing to be aware of is that current IVF success rates in Australia and broadly across the globe are around 30% for any given cycle.
Yeah.
So it's actually quite a low success rate, and that hasn't shifted much at all in decades, despite a lot of research being poured into optimizing those processes.
Yeah.
So this has important implications for considering family planning when it comes to not only maternal age, but paternal age as well.
Yeah.
I guess while age can't necessarily be changed, there are definitely modifiable lifestyle and environmental factors that we can control to optimize overall health and reproductive health.
Yeah. It's really interesting because you said that there's so much research that's being poured into this. Do you think the fact that the percentage is so low, does that put people off from wanting to use processes like IVF, and also considering it's quite expensive as well?
Yeah, I definitely think that processes like IVF do have limitations in terms of the cost burden and who can access it, but that's becoming a lot more accessible. For example, we've got now government-funded free cycles that have become recently available within Victoria, for example, in Australia. And around the world, a lot of governments do fund IVF cycles. So cost isn't as much of a barrier as it has been in the past. But I also do think these are quite invasive techniques. It requires a lot of injections, the hormone stimulation. Yeah. Often a lot of the burden falls on the female partner in the relationship. So it's definitely a challenging process, not to mention the emotional stress and burden that it can have. So if we can optimize fertility without needing those interventions, that's definitely the ideal scenario.
Yeah, for sure. And moving into, the concept of healthy lifestyle, what is that in the context of reproductive health?
Okay, so when it comes to a healthy lifestyle and fertility, I think there are things that we're definitely all aware of and very familiar with that are really important, like good diet, regular exercise, maintaining good sleep habits and low stress levels, as well as other lifestyle choices that we might make, like intake of caffeine, drugs, alcohol, and cigarette smoking.
Yeah.
I think some other factors to really consider in terms of overall health that might be a bit less obvious, but still that we know are important for reproductive health, can be things like infections or more chronic health conditions like autoimmune disorders. And these types of conditions can really cause inflammation in the body, and that can be very damaging for reproductive health. Yeah. So it's important that those other less obvious kinds of factors are treated and managed to ensure that reproductive health is protected and maintained.
Yeah.
And I guess while we might be aware that these kinds of things impact on fertility, there might be some gaps in our understanding of the exact reasons why these things are so important for reproductive health. So improving this knowledge of how exactly diet, exercise, stress and sleep and other factors impact on fertility might help to drive people to maintain more healthy lifestyles to protect this.
Yeah. And is there a role that diet and nutrition plays in all of this in the long term and short term?
Yeah. So firstly, I'd definitely like to clarify I'm not a dietitian. I'm a reproductive biologist, but can comment on some of the evidence from the literature that really links diet with reproductive health, because this is quite a well-studied area.
Yeah, of course.
It's become increasingly important in recent years for a number of reasons, I guess, including new trends in moving towards healthier lifestyles and the wellness movement, as well as higher prevalence of certain digestive disorders, a lack of time that leads people to possibly consume more prepared and processed foods, and then in some cases personal choices to not eat certain classes of foods, like meat, I guess, among other factors.
Yeah.
But good diet is becoming increasingly more recognised to be intimately linked with reproductive health and fertility. And the broad reasons for this is that a healthy and balanced diet can help to regulate levels, different circulating key factors in the body, including insulin levels, stress hormones, and inflammatory proteins or factors. Those are all known to regulate and interact with our metabolic, cardiovascular, and immune systems. But it's becoming more apparent that they're also intimately linked with interactions with our sex steroid hormones. So in men, this is testosterone, and women predominantly estrogen, for example. So any imbalances in those metabolic regulators or immune regulators can interfere with our sex hormones and cause disruptions to our reproductive function, or they can even cause damage within the reproductive tissues themselves. So several diets have become really popular, I guess, over the last few years to decades even, and different patterns have emerged, such as healthy anti-inflammatory, weight loss diets, Mediterranean diet, vegetarian and vegan diets, and the ketogenic diet.
Yeah.
And they're all probably, I guess, distinguished by specific macro and micronutrient compositions. So macronutrients are the nutrients we eat in the largest amount in our diet. So that includes 3 classes, which is carbohydrates, fat, and protein. So considering some of the research that's been done into fats, for example, while we know our bodies really do need healthy fats, excessive fat intake can be associated in women with ovulation disorders and obesity, which can both impair fertility. Mm-hmm. And likewise in men, too much fat in the diet is associated with lower sperm number and motility, which are both essential for fertility. For carbohydrates, similarly, too much is a bad thing for both male and female infertility. And the potential adverse associations are probably attributed not only to the carbohydrates themselves, but the impacts they have on the insulin and metabolic levels and system within the body that interacts with the sex hormones and the reproductive tract.
Yeah.
And then for protein in general, lean protein intake has a positive association with reproductive health and function in the literature, but this is quite dependent on the source. So, for example, protein supplements can have lots of additives like sugars and caffeine that are not great, and some might even have estrogens in them, which can disrupt the normal balance of hormones within the body for both men and women. And even too much dairy or animal-based protein can tip the scales from being beneficial to being possibly detrimental.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess one last new area of interesting research in terms of diet and fertility has emerged to be the gut microbiome. So we know that diet can have substantial impacts on the composition of bacteria found within our digestive system, and that's called the gut microbiome. So this can impact on how we absorb nutrients, the function of the immune system, cardiovascular system, insulin levels, and even body composition like fat and muscle mass. And all those factors are known to interact with the reproductive system and our hormones. And a lot of research is now being done, including some by our lab, to explore the more specific links between this, understand how they're linked, and whether or not this is something that could be modified to optimize fertility in the future.
Yeah. And we've talked a lot about like food and nutrition, but what about other factors like sleep, stress, or environmental exposures? How does that impact fertility?
Yeah, when it comes to sleep, I guess we can think of this in a really simple analogy to charging our devices like our phones. So if we don't recharge them, we just simply won't function optimally.
Yeah.
The part of the brain that regulates the sleep and wake hormones in both sexes is also responsible for actually triggering the daily release of hormones that impact on ovulation and sperm maturation. So sleep is intimately linked with the regulation of our sex hormones. In women, a lack of sleep over the long term can have a direct effect on the reproductive tract and hormones, and obviously acute effects as well. For men, as testosterone can be altered by sleep, sleep is really important, but there's definitely a sweet spot when it comes to sleep in both sexes. So research has shown that too little sleep, which is classified as 6 hours or less, can be detrimental for reproductive cycling or menstrual cycling in women, as well as ovulation and sperm production and motility in men as well. But on the other hand, too much sleep, which is classified as 9 to 10 hours or more, can also actually be detrimental to those hormone levels. So there's definitely an important balance with sleep and fertility.
Yeah. And there are so many factors at play here. So how do you recommend people sort of deal with all of this without stressing too much about getting the exact right amount of sleep, the exact amount of protein they need, and, all of that?
Yeah, I think it's all about balance. And we're all going to have late nights, early mornings. We're all going to consume fast food and takeaway every now and then, but it's all about balance. And as long as you're doing the right things for the majority of the time, I think that's part of a normal lifestyle in this day and age. I think that's very reasonable.
Yeah. And when we talk about lifestyle, I feel like physical activity is a huge part of that. So how does that play into reproductive health?
Yeah, so when it comes to fertility and reproductive health, body composition is something that's really important to consider. In particular, I think with regards to fat stores within the body. And the reason for this is that adipose or fat cells can actually produce some of the sex steroid hormones that are crucial for regulating our menstrual cycle or ovulation cycle in women. For example, estrogen's produced by fat cells. Yep. So while that's an essential hormone for reproductive health, as well as bone, heart, and cognitive function, unfortunately, too much estrogen, even in women, can throw out our cycle and lead to irregular ovulations, disrupted menstrual cycling, and alarmingly, really high levels of estrogen over prolonged periods can lead to the development of hormone-sensitive cancers, such as breast or uterine cancer.
Yeah.
And then for men, obviously, the production of estrogen can throw out their balance of their androgens, like testosterone. So too much fat can be detrimental, and I guess estrogen production is one of the reasons why. In both men and women, excess fat can also lead to the production of inflammatory factors that we know are really bad for reproductive health, as well as insulin resistance and that throwing out that balance of the metabolic system.
Yep.
So regular exercise helps to balance our sex hormones. It helps with our normal metabolic functions, including insulin levels, as well as maintaining or limiting inflammation in the body. And these are all essential for ensuring healthy fertility. I think in general, most types of exercise are beneficial. So there's nothing that's really damaging, but it's important to note that there's been some research around, I guess, more extreme forms of exercise like bodybuilding.
Yeah.
And that comes along with the supplements, which can also sort of throw out our normal cycles.
Mm.
And then I guess on the flip side, too much exercise we know can also disrupt cycling, particularly in women. For example, in very elite athletes such as gymnasts or ballerinas, we know that their reproductive cycling and hormones can be temporarily halted.
Okay.
These can usually resume normally later. And I guess more research is being done around activity-based anorexia as well, because we know that has definitely temporarily halted impacts on cycling and fertility.
Yeah.
But whether or not that has ongoing or lasting impacts is the source of ongoing research, including some from our lab.
Okay, interesting. And I want to touch back on stress. What happens if someone is experiencing too much stress in relation to fertility?
Yeah, I think stress is a very important consideration, and quite a lot of research has been done in this area. It links stress with reproduction and fertility, but I still think we're at a bit of a point where the evidence can be conflicting. And I think this is because it's a complex relationship between mental well-being and infertility, where infertility itself can cause stress to patients through emotional and financial burdens. But in turn, mental health disorders such as depression and anxiety can also lead to impacts on fertility.
Yeah.
Some biological markers of stress have been quite extensively studied and correlated with fertility. So cortisol is the primary stress hormone released in the body through activation of the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis.
Yep.
And cortisol is reported to affect reproductive function through causing immunosuppression or dampening our immune system and its ability to respond to different challenges in the body.
Yeah.
So effects of cortisol on IVF cycles have been studied in the past, and as I said, results were conflicting. So 5 major key studies report low cortisol or maintaining low stress levels positively impacts on IVF success in those cycles.
Yeah.
But 3 studies actually found the opposite, whereas there was either no effects or higher cortisol levels were shown to be better, which is quite confusing.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to note it's usually harder to study fertility and conception and correlate lifestyle factors outside of the setting of IVF cycles because we're not necessarily able to poll the population in epidemiological studies when they're sort of going through a natural conception cycle. So it is a little bit trickier to study the relationship between stress and more natural conception cycles outside of that IVF setting. So that's a big source of ongoing research in the field.
Yeah, and there's so many factors at play here, clearly. Is there a right time in someone's life to start considering their lifestyle choices and like making changes?
Yeah, I think in this context, it's quite important to consider the differences between men and women and our bodies and the way we produce and maintain eggs and sperm, for example, required to sustain fertility. So people assigned female at birth, or women, are born with all their eggs in their ovary to last their lifetime fertility. So that means that once depleted, they can't produce any new eggs. And when there's not enough high-quality eggs remaining in the ovaries, that signifies the end of the fertile lifespan for women, and menopause onset will gradually occur after that.
Okay, yeah.
I guess if we zoom in a bit further and be more specific, one important point to note is that after puberty, those eggs exist in the ovary in different states of growth or maturation or development. So the largest pool of eggs in the ovary is in a resting or sleeping state. So they haven't been activated to grow and develop. Then with each menstrual cycle, a handful of eggs become activated at a time. And generally, it's thought that this process takes around 12 months from egg activation to the actual ovulation of a mature egg capable of being fertilized and making a healthy baby. So if we think about lifestyle factors that might impact on immediate fertility in women, we're thinking about that 12-month period of egg activation and maturation and growth. And anything that a woman might be exposed to in that time can really impact the quality of that ovulated egg in that 12-month period. Having said that, it's important to maintain the pool of resting and sleeping eggs as well. Yeah. But if we're thinking about immediate fertility, it's that 12-month window. In contrast, men are born with specialised stem cells, and that can enable a more constant production and supply of sperm after puberty. So maintaining the health of those long-lived stem cells is really important across the whole lifespan. But again, zooming in, if we're thinking about the more immediate timeline of sperm development and what could sort of give rise to a baby in any given cycle, that process of sperm maturation from production takes 3 months. So it's a lot shorter. Yeah. So a focus on that period of time immediately prior to trying to conceive could really boost the chances of having higher quality sperm and a better number of sperm. So that means considering things like stopping drinking alcohol or other substances and really honing that focus on healthy diet and exercise and lifestyle factors like sleep and stress in that time. Again, not to say you shouldn't do that across the lifespan, but that 3-month window can be really quite important.
Yeah, great. I actually didn't know that, so it's really interesting that there is that sort of like 12-month sort of period, which I find really interesting. I'd love to talk about a practice that you do to prioritize a healthy lifestyle.
Yes, so I spend a lot of time walking my dog at the park or beach, either before or after work. I think it's a really nice way to start or end the day, take some time out in nature and gather my thoughts. It makes me happy when our dog's outside and happy too. But something else I really prioritize and take time for myself is to do Pilates classes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess Pilates is a great mix of strength and conditioning exercise. And I find going to the studio and doing the classes in a group setting has the bonus aspect of the social connection with others. I've found this something that's really compatible with pregnancy in particular.
Yeah.
As a lot of studios run specialised prenatal classes. So you know you're doing the right types of exercises and not doing any harm or injury. And it's been a really great way to connect with other mums-to-be in my local area.
Yeah.
Discuss all things pregnancy, which even being a reproductive biology researcher, just nothing's can sort of prepare you for the realities of pregnancy. And I guess I could say the same for motherhood beyond that as well. So meeting people going through the same thing's been really beneficial and important.
Yeah. And in terms of like things that you've been watching out for, like during your pregnancy or before, is there anything you can pinpoint?
Yeah, I think a lot of these lifestyle factors I tried to sort of implement. And I think what was a little bit challenging for me was trying to educate my partner around these topics as well.
Yeah.
And trying to get him to understand all the things that I know through the research, and get him to get on board and believe they're important too. So, yeah, just boosting his level of exercise and making sure we were both eating well and sleeping well and stress levels were maintained at a lower level. Yeah. All of those things I think I really tried to implement beforehand.
Yeah. And in terms of what other people can do, how do you recommend they find a practice that works for them? Like you mentioned Pilates has been really good for you, and then you also mentioned the sleep as well and the stress levels. So how can they find something that they want to focus on?
Yeah, I think, as you said, everybody is so different, and it is really essential that they find something that works for them, because what works for one person isn't going to work for everybody.
Yeah.
There are so many things we can do. Even social connection is so important for our mental health and well-being, and that can be in so many different forms. Like spending time with friends and family, joining a new group, getting a hobby, just meeting like-minded people. But yeah, some people might prioritize things like meditation or deep breathing, going to classes rather than self-motivation. I found during COVID, we couldn't do a lot of those things. You can do a lot of things online, like on YouTube. There's so many yoga classes, meditation classes, Pilates classes, or high intensity workouts that you can do at home that are, more cost friendly.
Yeah.
So accessible to everybody, but it really is about getting that motivation.
Yeah.
And trying different things to find out what you do and don't like as well. Like that's very important, as we both agreed. Not everybody's going to like the same thing.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you for sharing that with us as well and what works for you. I'd love to round off with our open mic section now. So here, I'm just going to hand it over to you and you can chat about anything that you would like to.
Sure. I might go back to something that we didn't necessarily cover, which was the exposures to some environmental factors. And I guess this is another really big prominent area of research at the moment, especially considering factors like climate change, which is driving up the temperature and causing heat stress in the body, for example, that can impact on fertility. But in addition to, I guess, changes in temperature, it's the release of different toxicants into our environment through air pollution, changes to the water composition that we drink, and then those factors can seep into the the soil and impact the composition of the food we consume as well. So it's a really big issue and a broad area to cover. But yeah, there's lots of factors to consider in our everyday lives that we come into contact with many different chemicals through the products we use, food we eat, air we breathe, and water we drink. So I guess we know that one class of chemical found in the environment in particular that's receiving a lot of attention is called endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs. And this is probably because they are known to have the biggest impact to potentially alter our sex hormones, because they interfere with our hormones and potentially reduce the number and quality of eggs and sperm, and therefore affect fertility and pregnancy as well.
Okay.
So studies show that around 95% of people have endocrine disrupting chemicals in their bodies.
Okay.
And people who struggle to conceive or have infertility and are seeking out treatments like IVF have even higher levels than the rest of the population. So there's a strong correlation with endocrine disrupting chemicals and fertility.
Yeah.
We know they can cause those problems because they can mimic or block the female or male sex hormones, including estrogen and testosterone, that interferes with our normal cycles and our sperm and egg number and quality.
Yep.
So what are endocrine disrupting chemicals and where do we find them? So I guess starting with the water we drink and food we consume. In Australia, we're very fortunate to have high quality drinking water, but things can still seep into the drinking water supply through the environment, or even through the transport as they make out their way to our homes and workplaces through pipes, for example. So some important trace impurities to consider here in particular are herbicides and pesticides.
Yep.
So high use of those in agricultural and garden settings, like even local parks and golf courses, can seep into our drinking water supply. And a lot of research has been done to show herbicides and pesticides are quite bad for reproductive health and fertility.
Yeah.
I guess another important exposure and something we can't necessarily control is the air we breathe.
Yeah.
So chronic exposures to pollutants from traffic, smoke or pollution, industrial emissions, or even more acute and rare exposures like house fires, industrial fires, or even bushfires, which occur on a big scale. They all produce environmental contaminants that can affect long-term reproductive health and fertility. And a lot of those pollutants fall into the endocrine disruptor chemical family. Yeah. I guess getting back to endocrine disrupting chemicals and our common day-to-day exposures, where we find them. So I guess people might have heard of parabens, which are used as preservatives found in food, cosmetics and personal care products. Bisphenols, in particular BPA, has a lot of public attention and people might know about that one. That's found in a lot of plastics like food containers, and they can leach into our food and drinks and be consumed. So heavy metals are the other ones that act as endocrine disruptors. They're more from the exposures like smoking, air pollution, or exposure to petrol when filling up our cars. So I guess it's impossible to completely avoid these exposures. They're all around us, but there are definitely some things people can do to take steps to reduce exposures. So something I've done at home is filter my drinking water, for example, just using a simple carbon filter like a Brita jug or other similar brands. You can even install in-home carbon filtration under your kitchen sink. And And a lot of workplaces are filtering the water as well now, which is great. Washing fruit and vegetables to remove those nasty pesticides and herbicides and other chemicals that might have been sprayed. Eating fewer processed foods, lower use of plastic wrappings, and making sure if you reheat food, it's not in a plastic container. Make sure you use like a plate or a bowl or something like that instead. And drinking from glass rather than soft plastics as well. So all the consumption through our food and water. But another important exposure is cosmetic products like shampoo, conditioner, makeup, deodorants.
Yeah.
So using organic products wherever possible. And this can be a cost prohibitive factor, but definitely something to consider, particularly if you're in that preconception window, because we don't realise how much we use those sorts of products and they're absorbing directly into our skin.
Yeah.
And we think of the food and water we consume, but not the absorption through our skin necessarily. So that's something we can change as well.
Amazing. I'm so glad that we were able to cover so many different things, because even though there is a wide variety of things we can be doing or changing in our lifestyle, I feel like it's important to know that it can start from home as well, like our water, the products we use, the fruit and veg we eat. So that's awesome. So thank you so much, Amy, for sharing all of that with us and your advice. This brings us to the end of our episode today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been, a real pleasure to discuss all things fertility. Thank you.
Thank you. And for people who want to find out more about your work, where can they go?
Yeah, so you can search me through Amy Winship through Monash University or on Twitter or X, the platform. I'm at Amy_Winship.
Perfect. Well, we've also got Amy's details down in the description below. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Altogether, the Family Science Insights podcast, produced by the Family Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating our show, sharing it, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people find it so that we can grow and bring you more quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website at fa.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Dina Sargent. Thanks for tuning in.